Good afternoon, good evening. This is Dan Hall with CareStack, joined with David Harris and Lori and Janina. You are in the right place, the right time. You're here for David Harris to learn more about embezzlement and what the embezzlers don't want you to know inside of your dental practice. It's going to be an exciting topic. All right, thank you, David. I'll pass it along to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Dan. And let's get to our PowerPoint show. We should start with a little bit of financial disclosure, and I'll mention that I'm the owner and actually the CEO of a company called Prosperident, and Prosperident has the mandate of helping dentists protect themselves against embezzlement and investigate it when it happens. So I'm receiving financial support by that means, and also you'll notice that CE Zoom Partners is presenting. And I particularly want to thank Darby Dental for being sponsors, and of course the great folks at CareStack for hosting. I'm going to start tonight by showing you a little piece of hidden camera video. So the video you're about to see was taken by a camera in a doctor's private office in their practice. Let's watch what happens. I've added a few explanatory captions, and I'm probably taking a few liberties, but you'll get the idea. And you see what she does there right at the end. She goes into the doctor's purse and helps herself. Now, what I just showed you is probably the crudest form of embezzlement imaginable. Most of what we see is a lot more complex and a lot better thought out than this, but this is the baseline. That's me in about 1981. Unlike probably most of you, I got kicked out of high school. I quickly got in trouble with the law. I ended up joining the Army because it made a lot more sense than going to jail. And once I got to the Army, I flourished in a way that I never really thought I would. Ended up getting promoted quickly, eventually got sent away to college, and had a very good career. I left the Army. I worked for a bank for a couple of years doing investigation, got frustrated one day and quit. And then the call came to me. I was sitting at home just trying hard not to think about the rest of my life. And the call came that would change that life. And it was from a dentist I'd been in high school with in my short stay there. And he had a suspicion about his office manager, and he had no one else to call. So I went to his practice that night and magically solved the crime. That was 33 years ago. Now I'm still here. Our company has grown a bit. We now have 23 people in total. And a lot of things have changed in our world since 1989 when I started, but the basics haven't. And one of the basics is how much we like when a doctor calls us and we're able to solve the problem for them. So let's start tonight with the relevance question. How likely is this? Well, the American Dental Association did a study a couple of years ago, and they asked 17,000 dentists, have you been stolen from? Well, let's start with the good news. 53% said, I don't think so. Of course, they don't know for sure, but that was what they thought. So you know what's coming. The other 47% said, yes, I have been stolen from. So the ADA asked them another question. How many times? And 26%, in other words, about half of those who said yes, said once as far as I know. 11% twice. 2% three times, and the one that really astounds me is that 8% of the respondents said that they'd been stolen from 4 or more times. So if you do a little frequency calculation and you take 26% times 1 and 11% times 2 and 2% times 3 and 8% times, let's assume just 4, what you end up with is 86 embezzlements have already happened per 100 dentists. Now, there are some things we don't know, and the biggest we don't know is how many of the 53% will get stolen from in the rest of their careers, and I guess for that matter, how many of the other 47% who said yes will get stolen from again in the rest of their careers. If you're a dentist listening to this, the suggestion I'd make to you is that there's something north of a 70% chance that you'll be stolen from in your career at some point. So then I want to point to a trend. And the study that I just showed you was done in 2019. In 2007, so 12 years earlier, the ADA asked the same question, and at that point, 35% of dentists had been embezzled. So if you look at what happened over a 12-year period, the number of dentists who reported that they'd been embezzled went up by about a third. And to point out the obvious, these are all pre-COVID numbers. It hasn't really been studied yet in a formal sense, but certainly at my company, we have noticed an uptick since COVID. A few more numbers I want you to have. The first is that when somebody's stealing, on average, they get away with it for almost 2 years. Sometimes it's a lot longer. I got a call yesterday from a doctor, and she has had the same office manager for 15 years. And she had her little epiphany the other day where she realized that the office manager had her hand in the doctor's cookie jar, and it seems to go back at least 7 years. So she's been getting away with it for 7 years. Almost every thief uses multiple methods. We see very few one-trick ponies. It's just like what you do with money in your 401k. You know, somebody somewhere says to you, don't take all your money and buy Apple stock. You need to spread it around. Well, embezzlers do the same thing with stealing. They use multiple methods, and the very constant norm is 3 different methods. And the final number I'm going to give you is that the average amount these people steal to the point where they get caught is $109,000. And sometimes theft is really small. It's, you know, maybe stealing pens from the office or stamps or something. And sometimes it's more than $1 million. We have part of our website called the Hall of Shame, and that's where we profile embezzlers. And part of it is what we call the $1 Million Club, which is embezzlement's really high achievers, and there are 9 of them. So let's ask the most basic of questions. Why do people steal? Well, I know because they can, but let's dig a level deeper. Embezzlers are usually driven by 2 forces, and I call them need and greed. And needy thieves are exactly what it sounds like. There's something going on in their life that has kind of turned their family finances upside down, and there's more money going out of the household every month than what's coming in, and they're stealing to balance the books. And if you want the classic example of this, picture somebody going through divorce, and the economics of divorce are that you start with 2 incomes supporting 1 household, and you move from that to 2 incomes supporting 2 households and a bunch of attorney bills. And that puts pressure on just about any family's finances, and sometimes people steal to make things work. So needy thieves have a monthly deficit, a monthly financial deficit that they're trying to fill. And they feel bad about the stealing, but they just don't think they have a choice. And then you have greedy thieves, and they're wired a little bit differently. Greedy thieves steal to address an ego deficit. So they like the money that they steal, and they will spend it conspicuously. But that's not really why they do it. They steal because they feel like society is not rewarding them properly for their massive talents. And they're taking what they think the doctor should be paying them in the first place. And the lady on the screen is a great example of a greedy thief. Her name's Misty Casanova, and that's her real name, not her stripper name. Misty worked in a practice in Texas, and she lifted $421,000 from it. Now, Misty would spend that money extravagantly, conspicuously. She would take a limousine to church. She would buy front row concert tickets. So this is somebody who officially was making like $62,000 a year, and she would plop down $8,000 to sit in the front row at a Beyonce concert. So what Misty wanted was she wanted her friends seated 152 rows back from her to see Misty there in the front row and think, wow, you know, she's got her act together. That's what I mean by an ego deficit. These people will spend money in ways that they think will elevate their status. So they'll take expensive trips, they'll buy nice clothes, they'll have cosmetic surgery. Those are all the kinds of things that greedy thieves will do. And they like the money, but it's not really why they do it. There was one of our alumni, as we fondly call them, who was stealing, and she won $3 million in the Georgia State Lottery. So picture for a minute what most of your staff would do if they won $3 million. You know, they'd quit their job. On the way out the door, they'd say whatever it is they've always wanted to say to you and just didn't feel the courage to do. This woman did neither of those things. She kept working and she kept stealing. And here's the instructive part. The amount she was stealing each month after she won the $3 million went up. So she was taking more as a millionaire than she was before. And that really tells us how the greedy thieves are wired. So how do people do it? Well, there are really two ways. And the first way is expense fraud. And expense fraud basically means making your practice pay something out that it's not supposed to. So messing with your payroll would be an example of expense fraud. Creating a fictitious supplier would be an example. Again, getting you to pay out something you're not supposed to, or as one person put it, an attack on your checkbook. The other kind of fraud is called inflow stealing or skimming. And what that means is taking patient payments or insurance payments. And between these two, about 80% of the embezzlement that we see involves skimming. In other words, expense fraud is kind of the sideshow, and taking patient payments or insurance payments is the main event. And when you wonder why CareStack brought you tonight's event, it's because skimming typically involves practice management software, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. I'm not going to get into a whole lot of detail here, but these are a couple of examples of expense side stealing. You know, a lot of practices have Amazon accounts, and we're increasingly seeing abuse of those because sometimes the doctors don't really monitor what happens in the Amazon account. And of course, there's manipulation of bonuses or payrolls. The people you're seeing in the back are all embezzlers. I've listed where they live and the amount of money that they've stolen. I guess what I'm saying is if you see somebody who looks a lot like one of your staff on the screen, you probably should reach out to us. So let's talk about skimming. And what's on the screen in the background right now is a thief's confession. And you can see what she said. I don't know how much I've taken, but it was under $500. One of the basic rules when people confess is they don't do it because they're carrying this grievous burden and confessing makes them feel better. They do it because they're trying to minimize how much they get punished. And what that means is that they don't confess to what they did. They confess to the minimum that they think you will believe. So on average, when a thief confesses, they confess to 1/6 of what they've actually stolen. In this case, she was giving herself way more benefit of the doubt than that. She'd actually taken around $40,000. In fact, we saw a number of days when she took more than $500 in that single day. So she knew darn well this wasn't right. The only other thing I want to highlight on the screen, and I'm not going to address it right now, but I want you to just kind of hold on to this, and we'll come back to it later, is the words right after what's underlined. I am being honest with you. Again, just hold that because we'll get back to it in about half an hour. So I'm going to let you all in on one of the secrets of the universe. And this is how an embezzler approaches the problem. And I hope you all know about what happens at the end of the day in your practice called balancing. And balancing is where a day-end report or day sheet from your practice management software is printed. And I expect most of you are CareStack users, but I'm going to use generic terms here in case we have people using other software. So every software prints a day-end report. The day-end report summarizes your collections, the fees, in other words, the total value of the work that you did, and adjustments. And there are two kinds of dental practices. There are those where the office manager hands this stuff to the doctor conducts a meaningful review of what was done and makes sure that the bank deposit lines up with what the software says was collected. And then there's the other 85%. And if you're not supervising the office manager in the day-end activity, then what happens is you make stealing easy, and the dumbest, laziest thief on the planet can steal from you simply by not depositing everything that was collected. If you are monitoring effectively the collections according to practice management software versus deposits in the bank, I can still steal from you, but now my challenge is a little bit different. Now what I need to do is I need to trick the software. I'm using PMS here for practice management software, not the other thing. You need to trick the software into underreporting how much money was collected today. To be clear, I'm not going to get into details, and I'm not going to answer questions today on how that happens. But what I'll tell you is that we see it with some regularity, and that gives rise to the numbers I gave you a few minutes ago, where I suggested there's about a 70% chance that you'll be stolen from. The other thing I want to say here is that when I talk to a lot of dentists about embezzlement, the picture they have in their mind is the theft of $20 bills. And to be clear, the first choice of every thief is cash. It is the easiest thing to integrate into their finances. It leaves very little trace when it leaves your practice. But the reality that thieves face is that the long-term trend for the amount of cash that practices take in is downward. When I started investigating in 1989, typical practice would take in around 8 to 10% of its collections in cash. The norm that we see now is more like 1.5 to 2%. And again, the trend is downward. A lot of practices, when COVID hit, went to contactless payment, which of course means no cash. So thieves have had to adapt, and they've had to find ways to steal checks or even credit card payments. None of that's very hard to do. The message, though, for you is that we need to think broader than $20 bills. In other words, if you think to yourself that if I stop taking cash, I will shut down embezzlement, won't happen. And here's an example of a stolen check. And you can see it's for a pretty big amount. This one's $15,000. The doctor's name was here. And all the thief did was sign it and deposit it. And we see this every week. So a lot of people believe that a check with their name on it is kind of inviolable, and it is not. It is childishly easy to cash a check with your name on it. And there are a couple of reasons for that, probably. The first is that you may have noticed this, banks don't always hire people the exact same week that NASA lays off rocket scientists. And secondly, because the banking system has gotten very automated. And automated means that it doesn't scrutinize checks as much as they once did. Back in the days when I was in banking, which was in the 1980s, there used to be somebody in each branch at the bank I worked at who would look at every single check. So in the morning, this trolley would roll up to their desk, and it would have this mountain of checks that had gone through the clearing system the night before. And this woman in my branch would sit there, and she would scrutinize every single check. And she would find all the all the mistakes, the check that wasn't signed, the one that was dated 2021 instead of 2022. She would catch the mistake where the amount in words was different than the amount in digits, all that kind of stuff. And none of that gets caught anymore, except on a very haphazard basis. And if you want to try a little experiment, write a check to your spouse, but don't put their name on it. Put your favorite Disney character. In other words, write the check to Minnie Mouse and sign it Donald Duck. And say to your spouse, don't go to a teller. Use an ATM, or even better, a smartphone app to deposit the check. And the chance that somebody from the bank will phone you and say, you know what, you really need to stay away from Orlando for a little while, very small. So, Dan, maybe I'll take a breath at this point and we'll see if there are any questions so far. If you have questions, please do what Dan said and put them in the question box in Zoom, and we'd love to get to them.
Yeah, sounds good, David. Yeah, this is really insightful stuff here. I mean, shocking to see that people are that bold. And again, folks, if you go to the Q&A down on the lower right-hand side, you'll see that you have that option to throw something in there via Q&A. We'll give everyone just a moment here, David, to see if we get some questions rolling in, or maybe somebody drops something in chat.
I think most of them are in a state of shock. And if you have Ativan nearby, feel free. All right. Well, we'll give them a little more time, and maybe I'll just keep talking as we go. I'm going to give you 3 things that we can do to combat this problem. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is pre-employment screening. One of the things that we see a lot of are what are called serial embezzlers. So these are people who will work in a practice and steal and get caught and get fired, and then 2 weeks later they're working across the street and they do it again and again and again. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what constitutes a proper pre-employment screening, and I think most of you are going to see some room for improvement. The second thing I'm going to talk about is reconciliation, and I touched on this process a few minutes ago, and I said if you are, as a dentist, are oblivious to the amount of money going into your bank account, in other words, if you don't line it up periodically with what CareStack says you collected, you have left yourself open for the easiest steal imaginable. All somebody needs to do is just divert some of the deposit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the reconciliation task and how you can block that relatively simple embezzlement. And the final thing I'm going to talk about is whistleblowing. And whistleblowing is when is designed to help facilitate when somebody else in your practice thinks something's going on, to make them willing to come forward. So let's talk about hiring. And the woman on the screen is like the world champion serial embezzler. She's gone by a few names. Irina Chernyakhovsky is the one she uses the most. She's also gone by Irina Fuchs. And happily, she lives in Canada, and most of you don't. So I don't think you have to worry about her specifically, but her accomplishments are noteworthy. She has worked in and stolen from at least 15 different practices. And the only thing that stops her relatively temporarily is when she gets sent to prison, which has happened a couple of times and takes her out of circulation for a couple of years, but then she goes right back at it. And even with all her practice, Irina's not a great thief. But what she is good at is convincing doctors to hire her. So how do we keep the Irinas of the world out of our practice? Well, it starts with fixing the identity of the applicant. So this needs to happen at the interview stage. In other words, you're sitting there interviewing somebody for a job, and what you now should say to them is, I just need to check your government issued photo ID and 2 pieces of secondary identification. And the secondary stuff could be anything: a gym membership, a library card, a credit card, a student ID. I want to see 3 pieces of identity with somebody's name on them, and of which one has a photo. And I want to do this at the interview, because one of the truisms here is that you can do all the investigating you want, but if you're doing it on the wrong person, it's pointless. In other words, if I have baggage and I'm applying for a job with you, but I have a brother a year and a half younger who doesn't, and we look a little bit alike physically, it is the easiest thing in the world for me to impersonate my brother. You do all the background investigation that you should, and it comes up clean, and you hire me, and then after that, disaster. So we want to check photo ID and do it at the interview stage. The logic of the 2 secondary pieces of ID, a lot of people have a forged driver's license or some kind of forged ID, but it costs money. And it doesn't occur to them to get the backup stuff that they might need, like, also forged credit cards or student cards or something. So the asking for 3 pieces is really a good way to catch them unprepared. I was talking to a group of young dentists a couple of months ago about this topic, and one guy put up his hand quite proudly, and he said, well, I always check references. And I said to him, I don't mean to burst your bubble, but the fact that you use the word references tells me that you're barking up the wrong tree. It is not remotely important to me what somebody's 8th grade science teacher or their parish priest thinks about them. The only people I want to speak with are people who saw them in an employer-employee context. And my rule is very simple. I want to talk to everybody they've worked for at least the past 5 years. I mean, no matter how much of a jackass you are, you can almost certainly find 3 people on the planet who will say good things about you. I mean, I'm sure Vladimir Putin has 3 fans somewhere. So asking for references is a very pointless exercise. Former employers. It absolutely astounds me that very few dental practices drug test applicants before they hire them. There are millions of jobs in the US I cannot get without a drug test, but I could work in most of your practices. And the irony is that unlike drivers for FedEx, who do have to be drug tested, you guys have the key to the drugstore. What I see as an investigator is how much crime is driven by drugs. And to me, to not be curious about whether that assistant passing you sharp instruments is high, just doesn't make a lot of sense. Whoops. Especially if somebody's going to be in a front office or financial position, we want to check their credit. And what I'm going to say about credit check, but it's really a much broader comment and applies to a lot of the things that we're looking at, is that we need to be interpretive about the results. And what I mean by that is if somebody has bad credit, that doesn't mean don't hire them. What it means is that now we have to dig a little bit deeper, understand why they have bad credit, and decide whether it poses a threat to the practice. For example, if somebody has a big medical bill and they don't have insurance coverage for it, in a lot of cases, that'll trash their credit. But it's a one-time, non-recurring kind of cause, and that bothers me a lot less than the person who just continuously lives above their means and destroys their credit in that way. So we need to dig in and find out what the cause was and then make a decision about whether or not they have a place with us. If somebody's working in a credentialed position like an associate dentist or a hygienist or a registered assistant, we need to verify directly with the issuing body that they're licensed. In other words, we should not be accepting a piece of paper from anybody that says that they're allowed to practice hygiene in your state. Forgery is really easy in 2022, and if I wanted to have a fake hygiene credential, I'm sure I could make one up. I don't hire anybody without looking at their social networking. And there are a lot of things that we could look at here. The kind of stuff I look at is anti-employer sentiment. In other words, the person who is bashing their current employer because when you hire them, they're going to do that to you. I look at really strongly held political beliefs. I mean, the people still screaming about the last election and how the president was robbed. You know, they're entitled to believe whatever they want. When it starts oozing out of their pores on social networking, it's also going to ooze out of their pores in your office. And I'm not sure you want your patients subjected to that. Another thing that I look at that's a little more subtle is the time of day when people post. And if people are posting on social networking during work hours, what you're about to hire is a time thief. And they'll be taking the extended restroom break twice a day and chatting with their friends. And while they're doing that, the rest of your employees are bruxing and doing their work for them. So that's another thing I look at in social networking. Excuse me. And the final step, and don't miss this one, is the criminal records check. I'm going to give you a really sobering statistic. 70 million Americans, so that's 1 in 4 adults, have criminal records. Now, like I said about the credit check, not every criminal record would stop me from hiring somebody. If I'm looking at hiring somebody and they got arrested for marijuana possession 20 years ago in college, that wouldn't bother me at all. On the other hand, check fraud 3 years ago is an absolute showstopper. I expect that as I'm saying this, what a lot of you are thinking is, you know what? It's so hard to find people right now that this whole activity is kind of pointless. I agree with part of that and not the other part. I think that right now with the great retirement and all that's come with it, a lot of dental practices have to lower their standards, and you end up hiring people or looking at people that you just wouldn't in other times. And I totally understand that. Here's what I'd say though. If you are going to lower your standards right now, you need to know by how much. And picture for a minute that you're the dentist in a pediatric practice and you hire somebody not realizing they were a child molester. I mean, that's, if there's a pediatric dentist's worst nightmare, that's got to be it. So yes, you may need to take people you wouldn't look at in other times, but it shouldn't change anything you're doing right here. Sorry, and there was a question that came in that I'd like to take. And what the attendee said is employers are not allowed to say negative things about former employers. That is categorically false. You can say the truth as long as it is factual. So if an employee stole from you, there is no legal prescription anywhere against, no legal prohibition anywhere rather, against saying that employee stole from me. Now, I don't think that's a good idea. I think there's a better way to give a negative reference. And here's how I would give a negative reference to somebody. So you get a call and it's either the person who embezzled from you or the hygienist who likes to use the same Profi cup all day, whichever one it is. And you fire them and you get a call from somebody who wants to hire them. Here's what I would say. My attorney has instructed me to confirm their dates of employment, and I will only answer one other question. And that question is, would you rehire this person? So when you say that, whoever's calling you is going to say, okay, I'll play your silly game. Would you rehire this person? And your answer will be, not in 100 million years. Okay, so if you're at all nervous about giving adverse information, you have said absolutely nothing about their behavior. You have simply said, under no circumstance that I could remotely possibly imagine would I rehire this person. Okay, so that's how you give a negative reference without saying anything. But again, to be clear, there is no legal prohibition against giving truthful information. In fact, in most states, that kind of conversation between a current or former employer and a prospective employer is what's called privileged. In other words, it's not even compellable in court. Let's talk about reconciliation. The people you're seeing on the screen are from our Hall of Shame that I mentioned earlier on our website. And a really good thing to do as well before you hire anybody is just run their name through our Hall of Shame and see if they show up, because we have about 700 embezzlers profiled there. So let's talk about how to oversee your practice financially. And the first thing I'm going to suggest is that the reports you rely on, doctor, should be ones that you printed yourself. As soon as you allow a staff member to print reports for you, you give up control of the assumptions under which those reports were generated. And it's entirely possible that what you're looking at does not tell the full story of the practice. So I strongly encourage you to print your own reports. If you're not sure how to do it, I am very sure that the great folks at CareStack will help you learn how. In fact, that's probably something they would love to teach you. So daily, there's a day-end report. What I want you to do is look at it, not necessarily to reconcile the bank deposit against the collections according to the report. What I want you to look at is to make sure that what went in the report, first of all, was consistent with what happened in your operatory, and secondly, was consistent with your policy. So if your policy is to collect co-payments when patients walk out the door, that report will tell you whether or not that happened today. I also want you to look at the adjustments, every one of them, and make sure you understand them and they make sense. Put your initials on that report so that you know that it's the one that you saw. And I'd like you to lock it up somewhere in a safe place, because someday you may need that. So that's on a daily basis. On a monthly basis, what I want to see happen is that the amount that was collected according to practice management software, according to CareStack, lined up with the deposits to your bank, your merchant account, and there's really one more category that should be here. If you use somebody who does some kind of third-party activity like Care Credit, who does patient financing, bank, merchant account, and Care Credit should line up with the collections in your practice management software. If those two things don't line up, potentially it's caused by what's called a timing difference. And a timing difference happens when software captures a payment at one time, but the amount hits your bank at a different time. So for example, if a patient pays by credit card today, CareStack will record that as a payment today, but it probably won't hit your bank account for a couple of days. So we're having this conversation on a Tuesday, probably Thursday or Friday, you get the money. If a month end happened to fall in between those two dates, so if somebody pays you on November 30th by credit card, now when you look at the month as a whole, the deposits according to CareStack are going to be a little different than the deposits according to the bank. That should really be the only cause of deviation between practice management software and your financial accounts. If there's more than that, then you have a problem. And the good news is you don't have to do this personally. There's an accounting firm that would love to do it for you, or maybe your spouse, or you have a kid in college who's looking to earn some money. Those are all other good, legitimate ways to do this. A few other things to look at on a monthly basis. Whoops, and one of those doesn't belong there, but I'll talk about that in a minute. The first thing is what's called your entry log or access log from your alarm system. So I hope you all have an alarm system on your practice. HIPAA more or less requires it. And what you may not realize is that the alarm company keeps a log. So whenever anybody arms or disarms your alarm, it gets captured in the entry log. And if you ask the alarm company, they'll be happy to send you once a month a PDF file that shows when people arm and disarm the alarm. What I'm going to talk about in a few minutes is the symptoms of embezzlement, the behavioral markers of embezzlement, and one of them is that thieves like to be alone when they steal. So looking at the entry log is your way of finding out if people are coming into your practice at weird times. The second one, and there's a little goof there, what I want you to look at is your accounts receivable listing, but I want you to do it two ways. First, the standard accounts receivable report that CareStack or your software, if you're using something different, will print. The second way I want you to look at it is to filter out the credit balances. And a lot of times if somebody's stealing, accounts receivable will start climbing and they will manufacture some credits as a way of masking that. So when you filter out the credits, you get a very different window into your receivables than you do if the credits are there. And the third thing I want you to do is anybody who sends you paper statements, your bank, your credit card company, get them sent to your house instead of the practice. If somebody sends electronic statements, they should go to a private email address that you control, not to, say, your office manager. Let's make very sure that you are the first person who sees that stuff. And if it's a if it's a statement that's emailed to you, you can always forward it on to the right person who has to deal with it. But let's put it in your hands first. All right, we're going to talk about whistleblowing. And I want to give you some interesting numbers. The number one means of detection of what's called occupational fraud, which is basically embezzlement. The number one means of detection nationwide when we look at all businesses is whistleblowers. And whistleblowers account for 43% of embezzlement. And when you think back to the, around the turn of the century and the really big frauds that happened, and you probably remember names like Enron and MCI and WorldCom, that stuff all came out because of whistleblowers. What gets interesting though is when we narrow our focus to just dentistry, that number goes down to 9%. In other words, a lot less people in dental practices come forward to their boss compared with virtually every other type of business. Why? Well, I can give you a couple of reasons. The first is we're dealing with small offices. And if there are two front desk staff and an office manager, and one of the front desk staff comes to the doctor and says, I have concerns about my boss, the office manager knows that he or she didn't rat on themselves, so they have it down to two suspects. A lot of staff have doubts. What if I'm wrong? Misplaced loyalty, which means that they view their primary allegiance to each other and their secondary allegiance to the doctor. And the final thing is a lot of thieves play sugar mama or sugar daddy. And what I mean by that is that they're giving other staff some benefit beyond what they're entitled to. Maybe if they have access to the payroll system, they've given a few staff members a raise the doctor doesn't know about, or they're paying them for extra hours. There's some kind of largesse that's coming to these people. And you've all heard that saying, you don't look a gift horse in the bicuspids. How do you deal with this stuff? How do you convince a staff member who's thinking about whether or not to come forward to do so? And of course, to state the obvious problem, you don't know that the staff member's having that dilemma. So the only way to do this is to have a whistleblower policy, to communicate with people in advance of when you think they need it. Look, if you come forward, I will totally respect your confidentiality. I will have this professionally investigated. If you're wrong about it, or whether you're right or wrong, I won't punish you or take any job action against you. These are the things people need to know before they come forward. In terms of the misplaced loyalty, the best thing you can do is give a reward to a whistleblower. I mean, if somebody comes forward and saves you a bunch of money, that should be rewarded. My company has a template whistleblower policy, and I'm going to give my email address at the end. Certainly, if you want it, send me an email and I'll be happy to give it to you. Let's talk about how Thieves Act. And what's behind this discussion is this. I mentioned American Dental Association studies, and in one of those studies that I put up on the screen earlier, one of the questions that embezzlement victims were asked was, how did you find out that somebody was stealing from you? And there were a lot of different answers. I mean, the day end not balancing is one, of course, but you know, sometimes people didn't want to take vacation, or there were lots of reasons. And when you looked at the percent of the time when somebody found embezzlement because of the way the thief was acting, it was about 2/3 of the time, and financial irregularities were only about 1/3 of the time. So it really will help you a lot to understand how people act when they're stealing, and then be vigilant for it. So let's look at some of the things that go on. And I mentioned this one already. When thieves steal, they want to be alone in the practice, partly because they don't want to be supervised while they're stealing, and partly because stealing takes concentration, and it's a lot easier to get that concentration when the phone isn't ringing and you don't have patients you know, wandering lost around the practice and so on. So thieves will tend to come in early, or they'll stay late, or they'll slide into the office on Saturday so that they can have that alone time. A lot of thieves are reluctant to take vacation, and when a thief is gone, they kind of give up control over how information moves through the practice. One of the biggest embezzlements I worked on early in my career was about $600,000 from 2 doctors. And it all came to light because the thief broke her leg on the weekend skiing, and suddenly receptionists were being asked strange questions that normally would have gone to the office manager, and that got them concerned enough that they approached the doctor. This one is really, really common. Thieves get territorial. And what I mean by this is they get possessive about their duties, and it might even extend to their workspace or their computer. I got sent a picture the other day from somebody wondering about embezzlement, and the office manager had 3 monitors, and when she went out, she would tape a piece of purple cardstock over each of them. You know, it's a really extreme reaction. And the cousin of territoriality is that thieves normally don't want to cross-train anybody else to do any part of their job, because that creates the possibility of devolution, you know, where the job gets broken up between people. The word that can really terrify a thief is consultant. They know they can fool their doctor, but when you say, I'm going to bring in a consultant, and there's one staff member who's visibly less happy about this than everybody else, that's a warning sign. Thieves cut ethical corners. They may run out on their landlord without paying out the rest of their lease. You know, if they find a wallet on the street, they're far more tempted to keep it than you are. And remember when I highlighted those words early on, I am being honest with you? Just as a general behavioral rule, when people say that, they don't mean it. People who are truly honest don't need to wave it around like a flag. And when somebody makes a point of saying, I'm being honest with you, that's a symptom of dishonesty, not honesty. So let's say next week or next month or next year, you suspect that a staff member is stealing. The biggest thing not to do is to telegraph your suspicions to the suspect. Why? Because if I'm stealing and I think that I'm about to go to jail, the list of things that I will refuse to do to prevent that's pretty short. Whoops, sorry, I meant to talk about the couple on the screen. The lady on the right is Shante Joyner Hickman. So she worked for a dentist in Baltimore named Dr. Albert Rowe. Shante was stealing from Dr. Rowe, and she thought she was going to get caught. So she came back one Thursday night when she knew Dr. Rowe would be in the practice alone doing his paperwork. She brought her cousin, he's the menacing looking guy on the left, with her, Dante Jeter, for some muscle. And the 2 of them took Dr. Rowe into the patient restroom and they beat him to death. And for that, these 2 model citizens received an aggregate of 40 years in prison. And of course, Dr. Rowe's family got him home in a box. I don't need to make this story any worse than it already is, but I'm going to. The amount they had stolen was $17,000. Final thought before we open it up to questions. There's a little intellectual battle that goes on here between doctor and thief. And you're better educated, you're probably smarter than the person stealing from you, and yet they manage somehow to beat you. How come? Well, I was talking with a friend of mine a few years ago. He's a very smart guy, dental CPA, used to be an engineer before that. And he was talking about something totally different, but it just drew this question sharply into focus. What my friend was talking about was the problem he was having in his backyard with his bird feeders and squirrels stealing his birdseed. And my friend tried everything he could think of to keep the squirrels away from the birdseed. No luck. Finally, in desperation, he went into a hardware store and he asked the man behind the counter for a squirrel-proof bird feeder. And the man behind the counter said, "Sir, there's no such thing." My friend wasn't giving up quite so quickly. He said, I can't be the only person with this problem. There's got to be a way to keep squirrels out of my birdseed. The guy from the hardware store came out from behind the counter, went up beside my friend and said, "Sir, I'm going to ask you a question and I want an honest answer." And my friend thought, all right, where's this going? The question was, "Sir, how much time each week do you spend thinking about the squirrels eating your birdseed?" And my friend's answer was, I don't know, 15 minutes possibly. Man from the hardware store said, "Sir, I'd like you to think about this from the squirrel's perspective. Whether the squirrel survives this winter depends on how successful he is at taking your birdseed. So he probably wants to eat that birdseed even more than he wants to have sex with Mrs. Squirrel. Sir, who do you think is going to win?" Well, I have a little video from my friend's backyard. Let's find out. This inverted bell is what they sell as a squirrel-proof bird feeder. And you can see what it does. It stops the squirrel from getting up and around into the happy place. Squirrel says, "I need a different look at this problem." And, it's kind of funny to watch, but the way that 2.5-pound squirrel outsmarts my college-educated friend is just about exactly what embezzlers do to dentists. There's some of my team, phone numbers there, websites there. I did not give my email address, but I'll give it now. It's just david@prosperident.com. If you want the whistleblower checklist, or if there's anything else you want to talk about, please feel free to reach out to us and we'd love to help. With that, Dan, let's end this.
David, I love the squirrel video. What a great way of putting it, like the time investment there of like the embezzler putting in the more time to work their way around it than you might be putting into.
They are pushed by some pretty powerful forces, and they're going to succeed for a period of time. And the question really is how long?
Yeah. Were there any other questions or anything else in chat? I don't have great visibility right now.
No, that was it. You got him.
Hey, everybody, I really appreciate it. Thank you for attending. David, thank you for going over such a great topic. It was really insightful, really engaging. Love the squirrel video. It's got to be my favorite yet so far after doing all these for a number of years.
Oh,
thank you all. Appreciate it. Have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you,
Thank you so much. Have a great night.